Ironically, for the males that have it, and there are enough males in this room that statistically one of you has it, the males also flare with sexual activity. They get painful ejaculations. They get burning and discomfort afterwards. They get urgency the next day. It's the same for both sexes. Men and women get different diagnoses. So the reason we don't recognize the disease is the early phase, you get bursts of activity, it goes quiescent, you attribute it to the antibiotics that you took or whatever. It's just the natural settling down of the flare. And that's why we haven't understood that why it's so common and why we miss the diagnosis in most people. Now that brings us to the point of, well, what triggers these symptoms? We didn't know 20 years ago, know a lot now. And for those people who say they don't know, I say again, read the literature. What's going on is a very basic process to the bladder. The kidneys have to clear all the foods, toxins, and all the components of food we eat that we need to live. We metabolize food, and we have to get rid of the waste products. They go out through the kidneys. They concentrate in urine. One of the really bad ones is potassium. The big pieces of this puzzle that we started to put together were first, that the reason we can all sit here with bladder full of urine and not have these urine waste products absorb into our bladder wall is because there's a marvelous mucus that lines the bladder. That mucus prevents resorption of all those toxins into your bladder wall. And Mother Nature figured it out a long time ago. All vertebrates have this mucus. Very critical to keeping these toxins in urine. When they dysfunction, then you absorb. When that mucus is bad, you absorb and goes into the bladder wall. It's same in the stomach, by the way. It happens in a lot of areas. The stomach, you secrete so much acid it would eat right through your bladder, your stomach wall in a few minutes, but the mucus in the stomach prevents that from happening. So mucus is one of the Mother Nature's way of protecting a surface. And in terms of the bladder, when it goes south, the question is why, what toxins cause it? And a huge piece of the puzzle came in about, I'm going to say about 15 years ago, when we looked at the mineral potassium. Potassium is second most common mineral in everything we eat. Actually, the most common mineral of most foods we eat. Second most common mineral in the body. You can't live without it. But the concentration in the urines is super. So the mucus prevents that potassium from leaking into the bladder wall, where it will directly stimulate nerves. It will stimulate muscle, give you bladder spasms, and you'll be incontinent. In fact, a lot of you probably have some problems with that. And so it's all about a bad mucus and cycling potassium to the bladder wall to generate symptoms. The other thing that we discovered is the process, this disease process, isn't specific to the bladder. And I'm sure that you will confirm this. The urethra hurts too. At least half the women, 3/4 of the men, have burning discomfort when they urinate or just pain in the urethra. So these processes can probably also affect the prostate. So this is a process that affects the entire lower urinary tract. These are the discoveries that we've made. Now, in terms of how the symptoms develop, they usually again trigger after sex. They trigger the week before the menstrual cycle. They also trigger during allergy seasons, which most of you may not notice, but I saw it a long time ago. And I'll mention it briefly. I know Dr. Theo Rees is going to deal with it, and it's very important because he taught me how to manage the allergies. But there'll be spring and fall flares. In San Diego County, it's late February to June, and then it's August through October when you'll see this flare activity. It can be pretty intense. So these are the key players. The question is, what do we do and what can we do? I mean, this is the key, is can we help you? Well, we learned in rabbits and rats that you can destroy bladder mucus and replace it with a 15-minute heparin treatment. We learned that back in the 70s, more in the 80s, more in the 90s. 15-minute heparin treatment. Heparin is a substance that's in part a component of mucus. So basically you're recoating the bladder with a drug that's similar to the mucus coating. That led the way to looking at these agents in the treatment of bladder dysfunction associated with mucus and all these symptoms. We actually did the experiments in humans where we took normal human subjects and we tested their bladder for absorption of solutes and potassium we put in there to see if they were sensitive, destroyed their mucus, and we can do that with a certain compound called protamine, and watched them all get symptoms and absorb the potassium and urea, another compound we looked at, and then we repaired it with a 15-minute heparin or Elmeron treatment. There are only two heparinoids in the world, heparin and Elmeron. There are other related drugs, but they're not quite the same. but they're in the class of compounds called glycosaminoglycans, but they're not quite as active as, those two particular agents. So that gave way ultimately to trials in humans, and then pentasam polysulfate, or Elmiron, was shown in several double-blind trials to be active in severe patients that were treated for 12 weeks, and it was approved for sale in the United States. Ironically, there have been 5 other studies and other drugs since then, and they've not passed that critical test. It's a very difficult to do a study on severe patients for 12 weeks and get a good answer. A lot of patients drop out, and it confounds the studies, but the bottom line is we have the tools in place now to study new drugs because we have good outcome measures to look at them, and all the industry and the FDA, everybody's sort of adopting them, and so we have a good hope for the future in that regard. But at any rate, that gave way to Elmiron. Well, the studies on Elmiron, looking at it, we didn't know when it first came out how effective it would be. We know it does not directly control your pain or your urgency. It takes time. It fixes the mucus problem. That we do know. There's a large clinical trial that showed that the sensitivity to putting potassium in the bladder changed dramatically in people who got better, several hundred patients. So we know that it changes as you improve, but what we didn't know was how long. And one study showed that done over 8 months, showed that at 4 months, 3 months, you got about a 40% response rate, but almost a 70% response rate at the end of 8 months. So there's another trial that was published earlier that showed comparable results. Somewhere between 60 and 70 people got better over the long term, and they stay better on the study that was done for several years.